Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out on an evening late in the quarter. Especially you students, we appreciate that things are getting really, really busy, and it's not a small thing that you're here. We're grateful. Thank you. I'm Greg Johnson, director of the Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life here at UCSB. Each fall, we host an event having to do with environmental ethics, so we're just thrilled that that's happening now, but a few prefatory comments. We are on Chumash land, as many of you know, and it's their ancestral land, but it's also their contemporary and future land, and we want to acknowledge that. This institution has not always been a good steward of this place. I'd like to think we're turning the corner on that, and I hope we continue to be held accountable by Chumash people to do just that, to do better for their children. The Capps Center is grateful to our co-sponsors, the Departments of Religious Studies and Chicano Studies, the Environmental Studies Program, and the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UCSB for presenting tonight's lecture. We are also grateful to Dr. Gregory Jarrett, who helps organize this event annually and has done so tonight and has brought many of his students. So thank you, Greg. And he will be helping to moderate questions after Professor Baugh's lecture. As I said, this lecture is part of the Capps Center's Forum on Ethics and Public Policy. Each fall we host a lecture on this topic, and I want to flag for you that we have an upcoming event here at UCSB on a similar topic, and this is a book award presentation honoring Sarah McFarland Taylor's book, Eco-Piety, Green Media, and the Dilemma of Environmental Virtue. And that event, which is presented by the Environmental Studies Program, will take place on December 2nd. So note that. All right, just to name the reality, many of us are facing collective stress right now for obvious reasons. Just want to name that. And as I've been grappling with that myself, how do we turn this to productive purposes? Well, certainly here at the Capps Center, we're trying to do the obvious, which is to surface and recalibrate some of our priorities. And two of the obvious candidates for that are to focus upon issues of immigration and the environment. And so it's our good fortune in that respect that tonight's topic, planned well before the election, addresses these issues. So we're grateful for that, and to be in solidarity in a safe space to think about these issues and, frankly, ways forward. We're honored to have Amanda Baugh with us to give this lecture, Falling in Love with Nature, the Values of Latinx Catholic Environmentalism. Amanda J. Baugh is professor and associate chair of religious studies and director of the MA program in sustainability at California State University, Northridge. Baugh specializes in the study of religion and American culture, focusing on the intersections of religion, race, and environmental justice. Her research explores power dynamics related to race, ethnicity, and class in the greening of American religion. She is the author of God and the Green Divide, Religious Environmentalism in Black and White, and the book after which this is titled, Falling in Love with Nature, the Values of Latinx Catholic Environmentalism, coming out this next week. Go to your bookstore or online to find it while it's still available before it sells out, because academic books always sell out. And then we get rich and retire. So, on that note of hopefulness, please help me welcome Professor Baugh. Thank you for being here. It's really great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I think you use this. So
I'll go ahead and use that, yeah. Cool. Thank you. Good evening. Does this sound all right? Yeah, okay. All right. Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Dusty, and thank you all for coming. I'm happy to see a lot of friends in the audience. It's very exciting to be here on your beautiful campus, so thank you very much. And I'm really happy to talk about my book here at UCSB, which, similar to Cal State Northridge, where I come from, is a Hispanic Serving Institute. The book that I'm about to tell you all about grew out of class conversations with my students, and I never would have written this book if I had landed somewhere else. I began formulating the questions for this book through conversations with my students who began to, they helped me see the limitations of the frameworks that I came to teach with that I learned in grad school. And this book started as a research project for my religion and environmental justice class with CSUN undergrads. And I had students with me throughout the research, helping me interpret the findings as, we'd drive down the 405 and talk about what the people had just said. I had students helping me interpret everything. And I'm really happy to see all the students here today because truly I wrote the book for you. So I'd like to start by sharing a story from the book. Maritza, a 30-something charismatic Catholic and a daughter of Salvadorian immigrants, had embraced a set of environmentally sustainable behaviors, like conserving energy and water, recycling, and not wasting food, for as long as she could remember. As she told me about these behaviors when we met at her church in 2015, Maritza explained that she was not involved with any specific environmental ministries or organizations, and she did not consider environmentalism among her top priorities. But simple home-based conservation measures were mundane aspects of her everyday life. Maritza sometimes prayed to God for relief from the drought that had plagued Southern California in recent years. And she also helped the earth by cultivating cacti and other plants in pots throughout her home. Taking care of plants was important, Maritza maintained, because plants provided oxygen. She was worried about the world's oxygen supply, given scientists' dire warnings about greenhouse gases building up in the earth. And she suggested that planting more trees could be a more helpful response. If each person who cuts down a tree would plant 10 more so they can grow, Maritza suggested in Spanish, the planet would have enough oxygen. So Maritza's reflections come from a focus group that my students and I conducted in 2015 in a large, predominantly Latinx parish on the outskirts of LA. We were there because we wanted to better understand the results of a survey that had recently been released. So it was a survey conducted by the Public Religion Research Institute back in 2014. And it was basically talking about religious identity, religious values, and understandings and attitudes towards climate change. And so this is in alphabetical order, the list of all the groups that were included in the survey where they had statistically significant enough numbers in order to include them. So take a moment to look. Does anybody have a guess about who out of this list might be the most concerned about climate change? Rudy's already seen the survey, so he can't answer. No guesses? You want to guess?
I mean, just based off the name of the lecture, I'm going to assume it's the...
Yeah. That's that smart UCSB degree working for you. Right. That is true. So it was Hispanic Catholics reported they were the most likely to be concerned. But when this came out at the, back in 2014 at the big meeting of the American Academy of Religion where all the religious studies professors go hang out every year before Thanksgiving. This was released and people were very, very surprised to find out that Hispanic Catholics cared the most. Who do you think they expected to care the most? Yeah, they would expect white people to care the most. Maybe Jews, mainline Protestants, right? Those are the people that were expected. So at first, when this came out, people were very, very surprised. But then after we kind of caught our breaths and stopped being quite so surprised, people came up with okay, actually this makes sense because look, Hispanic Catholics care the most, Black Protestants are way up there. I know why. It's because of environmental justice, environmental racism, environmental suffering, right? Communities of color are much more likely to suffer from climate change and other environmental problems, so that must be why they care the most. All right, so that is a reasonable explanation. It's supported by the survey findings, which also found that communities of color, in the survey, they found communities of color were more likely to believe that climate change would impact them directly. This was back from 10 years ago before we had quite as much evidence of the climate crisis around us every day. So people were pretty skeptical. Okay, so everybody's like, okay, we know why Hispanic Catholics and Black Protestants care the most. It's because they're suffering the most from environmental problems. But at that time, I was just finishing up writing my first book where I was talking about ways African Americans were interested in the environment for reasons that go beyond a narrow focus on their disproportionate suffering. And based on my research from that book and reading scholarship by Alonda Clay, I suspected that there was more to the results of this survey in addition to environmental suffering. I also thought there was more to the story because I'd been teaching at CSUN for a few years already at that point. CSUN is full of first-generation college students. I think like something really high, like 73% of our students are the first in their family to go to college. I think 56% Latinx. It's, a very predominant with minorities and first-generation college students, et cetera. Those students claim not to be environmentalists. So if I walk into a room, I've actually done this experiment. I did it a number of years ago. I was visiting a guest. I was guest lecturing in somebody's class, and I said, like, hey, raise your hand if you're an environmentalist. The first time I did it, there were 3 students in the room who appeared to be white, and they were the ones that raised their hand. That was a number of years ago, but I tested it out again this year. Exact same results. All right. My students who are white identify as environmentalists. Students of color don't. Okay, but guess what? I didn't know this when I first started teaching there, but I've gotten to know my students over the years. Many of my students who insist they're not environmentalists engage in all kinds of eco-friendly practices. They ride public transit. They recycle. They don't waste food. They eat vegetables from their backyard garden. But they say that's not environmentalism because it's an expression of poverty or culture, not concern from the environment. They say, no, we recycle for the cash. We use public transit because we can't afford a car. So that's not environmentalism. I've seen this throughout my research as well. Community members who are doing things that I would consider to be very eco-friendly, but they insist that it's not environmentalism because they're doing them for other reasons. So the implication is that when I, a white, middle-class, urban, environmental humanities professor, recycle or ride the bus, that's environmentalism. But when people from other backgrounds recycle or ride the bus, that's not environmentalism. So that's ridiculous, right? It seems absurd, but it reveals kind of this hidden moral assumption that a lot of us share when we think about environmentalism. The unexamined assumption is that you have to have certain pure motivations in order for your acts to count as environmentalism. If your actions are motivated by something else, like poverty, necessity, or even concern for fellow humans, it's somehow seen often as less valid as an environmental act. This leads us to associate environmentalism with people like me, who are affluent. I'm not that affluent, but whatever. Affluent and white, but also frequently fly on airplanes, live in relatively sizable homes, own cars, purchase clothes, etc. We don't associate environmentalism with the behaviors of people like my students who don't so intentionally think about environmental matters, yet live much more lightly on the earth. So going back to that story of Maritza and her fellow churchgoers, my students and I were visiting her church in 2015 because we suspected that there was more to these survey results than simply an explanation based on suffering. So I want to take a moment and be clear, the environmental justice movement is essential. We need to talk about environmental racism. My point is simply there has to be more to the story. If we can only think about environmental values among communities of color through a focus on the ways they're suffering from environmental problems, we fail to recognize the many other ways that diverse communities might relate to the natural world as agents, not just as victims. Maritza's example of cultivating plants in order to improve the air quality offers a compelling counter-story that undercuts that dominant framework of victimhood. And Maritza was definitely not the only person in her prayer group that night that described this active set of environmental values. So these stories illustrate a striking need for new narratives of environmentalism. So that's what I'm going to do in my talk. I'm going to demonstrate how our understandings of environmentalism necessarily change when we place Spanish-speaking Catholics at the center. I'm going to start by briefly discussing some ideas that are commonly associated with environmentalism, including both secular and religious coalitions, and the types of activities that these activists support. In the book, I developed this concept called white racial frame environmentalism. I'm just going to kind of touch on it here and use those examples to illustrate it. Then I'm going to discuss another framework that I'm calling La Tierra environmentalism. And this is an embodied ethic of living lightly on the earth that I argue has been hidden in plain sight because it doesn't look exactly like we would expect environmentalism based on that dominant white framework. Drawing stories from my research, I'm going to tell you 3 main aspects of La Tierra environmentalism. And then in the conclusion, I'll discuss the implications of this research for scholarship, policymaking, and activism. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about the type of environmental activism that I grew up with and that might be familiar to some of you. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s in a progressive, white, middle-class family that supported environmental values and the environmental movement. My parents like to say that they participated in the revolution when they were students at the University of Texas in the late 60s and early 70s. And their activism continued into my early childhood. So that's my mom holding my older brother, at an anti-nuclear protest. They're hippies, right? As a kid, I remember reading the book, 50 Simple Things Kids Can Do to Save the Earth. I wore t-shirts and made bookmarks telling people to save the whales. That was a thing in the 90s. My parents became ethical vegetarians when I was in high school, and I followed suit my first year in college. As a college student, I also worked as an intern for the Sierra Club, and I volunteered at a local organic farm. So there's me holding a baby goat, which was a lot of fun. So all of these actions were connected to this idea that it's important to save the earth, that we humans need to save the earth, that environmentalism is something good and something you want to aspire to be. These environmental values that I held and still hold, I have inherited these, come from the long history of the American environmental movement, which can be traced to late 19th and early 20th century efforts to protect uninhabited nature from the incursion of human civilization. So this history draws from environmental heroes such as John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt, who worked to establish the first national parks, an effort that was supported by settler-colonial relationships with the land. Aldo Leopold, an early environmental ethicist who advanced his theory of a land ethic, suggesting that the land itself has inherent rights. Have the environmental ethics students read Leopold yet? Yeah. All right. Have y'all read Rachel Carson? Yeah. Rachel Carson, the eminent nature writer who famously sounded the alarm about the harmful effects of pesticides like DDT on what we now call the environment. So these are two canonical writers that you all are familiar with. They're central to the modern environmental movement. And there's a scholar of religion and environmental studies named Anna Gade, who's in Wisconsin. She's written some interesting work about these two figures in particular, that they started this thread of environmentalism that's kind of based on our feelings, and that we have certain feelings of the environment motivated by crisis, alarm, fear, and then alternatively love and hope. That a lot of environmental thought is grounded in feelings. So we need to have the right feelings to inspire action. So these are kind of some of the foundational thinkers that have led to the ways that we relate to the environment now in many cases. In the 21st century, this legacy is carried forward through public figures such as these. We all know Al Gore. You do know Al Gore, right? Yeah. I did this with some of my students, and they're young enough that they weren't really sure who Al Gore was. But anyway, Al Gore, who drew public attention to climate change with his 2006 documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. Leonardo DiCaprio has documentaries about climate change and his foundation to fund environmental projects. We all know Greta Thunberg, the famous Swedish teenage environmental activist who began the global movement of school strikes for the environment. Since the 1990s, environmentalism has been a central cause of a lot of religious organizations also, including Hazon, which is an environmental organization that works with Jewish communities, the Global Catholic Climate Movement, and Interfaith Power and Light, which is a national organization. They have chapters in almost every state. I have another one from Interfaith Power and Light because religious environmentalists really like solar panels. There's lots of photo ops of religious people with solar panels. But these groups often rely on scriptural passages, religious traditions, statements, big statements written by religious leaders saying that, if you're a Jew, it's important to take care of the earth. If you're a Catholic, it's important to take care of the earth. All right. What is the theme we note here? What do you notice about all my pictures? They're all white. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So obviously I chose these pictures on purpose to make that point. There's lots of communities of color also engaged in environmental activism. So I'll note Latino Outdoors, Green the Church, which is working with mostly the African American Protestant church. There's a really cool organization in LA called Mujeres de la Tierra. That's kind of a grassroots organization. Ramon Cruz was the first Latino president of the Sierra Club, starting in 2020, and he wrote the foreword to my book, which was pretty cool. And then also the MA students in sustainability at CSUN. So these are all to illustrate, like obviously I picked those other pictures on purpose to illustrate my point. People of color do care deeply about the environment, but their stories are rarely told. They're rarely included in our mainstream environmental narratives and assumptions about what environmentalism looks like. And that first set of pictures that I show you, that's what my students are thinking of when they tell me that they're not environmentalists. And I'll just be clear, I'm not suggesting that first set of pictures is bad or wrong, that we need to change everything. It's just that there's other entry points as well, right? So that's one entry point. It's not to say that all that other stuff is bad. I'm just pushing back against the tendency to universalize them and say that's the only way of relating to the environment. And so it kind of pushing back against that universalized narrative is a main reason why I wrote this book, to help my students and fellow scholars and activists see that there's many ways of being an environmentalist. All right, so now I'm going to move forward to my research. We're going back to 2015. In 2015, I started conducting research on environmental values among Catholics in Los Angeles. The first reason was that Public Religion Research Institute survey. I forgot to show you, I'm not going to go all the way back, but if you happen to notice, Hispanic Catholics were at the top and white Catholics were at the very bottom. So initially, I conducted a lot of research both with Hispanic Catholics and white Catholics, and that ended up being, to find Hispanic Catholics, it was Spanish-speaking Catholics, so people who choose to worship in Spanish. They might have been bilingual, but they chose to worship in Spanish. So that was kind of how I found Latinx Catholics, and then I did a lot of research among white Catholics. You can't really just go to somewhere in LA and just find a group of white Catholics, but I had Spanish-speaking and English-speaking Catholics were the two kind of dividing lines. But anyway, so the book ends up focusing primarily on Latinx Catholics, but the research involved white Catholics too, and there is a chapter on my research among white Catholics in there as well. Okay, so the PRI survey was one reason why I started talking to Catholics in particular, and also, has the environmental ethics class read Laudato Si'? Any Pope Francis? I'm going to take a quick sip of water while y'all contemplate. All right. So that PRI survey came out in 2014, and then shortly thereafter, I had kind of already started conducting research trying to interpret the results of that PRI survey, and then I found out that Pope Francis was about to release this big encyclical, this big important church teaching document on the environment, basically arguing that Catholics and actually everybody needs to be very concerned about climate change and take action. So those are kind of like the two reasons why I ended up doing this research project on Catholics in particular. Basically, for the methodology, we started initially conducting focus groups. In fact, before Laudato Si' came out, we were just doing focus groups in this one particular neighborhood, and we were going to try to figure out kind of how different congregations in that one neighborhood related to the environment. But we did this first focus group with Spanish-speaking Catholics, and the findings were incredible. It was like, okay, there's something important here to study. So with that in Laudato Si', we focused on just Catholics. So basically, we did focus groups among both English-speaking and Spanish-speaking Catholics, and we did not say that we're interested in the environment. I basically explained it as a study of how your Catholic faith shapes your daily life. And we'd start asking questions, and then I would shift. I'd said, lately, immigration and the environment have been important issues on the news. What does your faith have to say about that? And then I asked lots of follow-up questions to, take us to the environment. And then at the end, I let them know that's what I was actually focused on. But anyway, so we did the focus groups, and I did a bunch of follow-up interviews with people from the focus groups. And then also I did research among groups of Catholics that were involved with environmental efforts, and particularly after Laudato Si'. There is a group it's not there anymore, but in Los Angeles, there's a group called the Creation Sustainability Ministry, which is predominantly white Catholics, and I do write about them a fair amount in the fourth chapter of my book. And there's another group called Fe Ecología, Faith and Ecology, and that was basically an environmental branch of the Spanish language young adult ministry through the Archdiocese. So I have research with them as well. So basically, it's English-speaking and Spanish-speaking Catholics, some who are involved in prioritize environmentalism and some who don't. So that's kind of the people that I was talking to for this research. All right, so now I'm going to tell you what I found through the conversations. When I first started this research back in 2015, community leaders often told me I should adjust my project because they thought Latinx communities wouldn't have much to say about the environment. Several priests told me to visit a predominantly white parish in Manhattan Beach because that church had an environmental ministry. They were doing this whole speaker series on Laudato Si, and they said, if I want to learn about Catholic environmentalism, go to Manhattan Beach. One Cuban American priest told me that in Manhattan Beach, they have the time and luxury of being able to spend time and resources on environmental issues. But the members of his working class, primarily Latinx parish, were in survival mode. He said they're overwhelmed with the struggles of daily life, feeding and clothing their kids. They didn't have time to worry about the origins of global warming. And yet, here are some of the statements that I heard in my first focus group conversations. And this was with a Spanish-speaking, it was an adult religious education class in Spanish. And the people in the class were fairly recent immigrants, very low income from Mexico and Central America. So here's one quote. From the moment we believe in God and all of his creation, we're already aware of nature and the connection humans have with nature. From the simple fact of being Catholic and believing in God and the Bible, we are 100% conscious of nature and the environment. Here's another one. God created everything and we have to love it. All creation is made by God and we must love plants like a brother. Not protecting the environment is the same as looking at a brother in the streets and not helping him. So even though I was conducting this focus group with those PRRI survey results in mind, I was still really astounded by these statements. My previous experiences with environmentalism, both as a scholar and as a citizen, were defined through this framework of white environmentalism. Within that framework, people of color appear almost exclusively through stories of environmental racism and injustice. So again, those stories are very, very important. But when we discuss communities of color only through a focus on disproportionate suffering, it implies they can become engaged with environmentalism only as victims of environmental problems. Active love and care for the earth, according to this thinking, is restricted to the domain of privileged white activists who have the time and energy to care about the plight of the polar bear. Going back to that slide, I would say if it was the white Protestants who were the most concerned about the climate change, nobody would have said, oh, it's because of environmental justice, it's because of suffering, right? So that was a problem that needed to be explained because it wasn't white people responding. Okay, so, as I conducted this research among working class immigrants from Mexico and Central America, and I heard statement after statement about treating the earth with love and respect, about protecting the limited environmental resources we've been given, about loving nature as a place to meet God. As my research progressed, I found that initial conversation was not an outlier. Through conversations about environmental values among Latinx churchgoers over the following 3 years, I identified a widespread ethic of living lightly on the earth that I'm calling La Tierra environmentalism. All right, what does La Tierra mean? The earth? What else? Any Spanish speakers? The ground, the earth, the ground. Anything else? The land, yes. And then there's one more. The homeland, right? Mi tierra, the homeland. So La Tierra can mean the earth, the land, and the home. So I'm building, when I talk about La Tierra environmentalism, I'm building on the work of a theologian named Jeanette Rodriguez. And she says that La Tierra theology, the way she's worked out La Tierra theology, is that it's a theological perspective that identifies a special relationship to the land rooted in the intersection of Catholic theology and Latinx culture. So she sees this theme in numerous religious resources and poetry, songs, literature across Latinx and Chicano culture. Rodriguez identifies expressions of this special connection with the earth throughout these cultural sources. It's especially tied to connections with the home and the homeland, and a spiritual connection with the earth, family members, and God. So there's a song. I'm not going to sing it for you, and I couldn't quite manage to connect to the internet, so I'm not going to play it for you either, unfortunately. But you can go home and find this on Spotify. It's a very good song. But anyway, it's called Mi Tierra. And these are, this is the chorus. Your homeland strikes your soul when you're gone. Your homeland pushes you forth from its roots. Your homeland sighs when you're not there. The land where you were born, you can never forget, because it holds your roots and everything you've left behind. She flows through my blood, my homeland. I carry her inside me. Yes, indeed. I sing of my homeland, beautiful and holy. I suffer the pain that is in her soul. Although I'm far away, I can feel her. So this is one song among many cultural productions that Rodriguez identifies, that she sees aspects of La Tierra theology in them. And after reading her articles over and over, I realized that her concept of La Tierra theology is really helpful for understanding the environmental values that Latinx Catholics shared with me throughout my research. So what she was talking about among these cultural productions was exactly what the people I talked to were sharing with me. So building on Rodriguez, I define La Tierra environmentalism as an embodied ethic of living lightly on the earth that's rooted in a sense of love and respect for God, fellow humans, and the rest of God's creation. So what I'm talking about here are those home-based conservationist measures that we've talked about already: backyard gardening, not wasting food, using public transit. And I argue these are not just expressions of poverty. They're part of a complex ethical system where living lightly on the earth is a way of showing one's love and respect for God and the family, and it's just the right thing to do. So I'm going to tell you 3 main aspects of La Tierra environmentalism that my interlocutors shared during my research. All right, so the first aspect of La Tierra environmentalism is that it involves active love for nature and concern for global ecological issues. So environmental advocates often try to engage minority communities by talking about environmental racism and environmental justice. La Tierra environmentalism shows that people of color can actively love nature and care about global ecological issues. In my research, Latinx Catholics did talk about traditional environmental justice concerns like human suffering related to the drought. They encouraged food conservation with awareness that many in their community didn't have enough to eat. But many also mentioned active love for nature and the environment, and they expressed concerns about global ecological issues. This was back a while ago. They were concerned about the first President Trump's energy policies, the Dakota Access Pipeline, climate change, natural resource depletion, consumerism, and more. Somebody I'm calling Carlos, I should mention all the names are pseudonyms. Carlos, a 31-year-old electrician who immigrated to LA from Mexico as a young child, specifically told me about polar bears when he was talking about global ecological problems. He said, if you don't take care of the planet, it's really going to be messed up. I mean, have you guys seen what's going on with the polar bears? It's sad, dude. Like, they're dying. I don't know about you guys, but I love animals. Many of my interlocutors also expressed a special connection with trees and indicated that close relationships with trees were a special marker of Latinx identity in the United States. So Carlos, that electrician, he told this story about taking his friends to his grandma's house. And his grandma lived in a predominantly white neighborhood. And he said that when they pulled up onto her block, his friends immediately could identify her house because it was the only one full of fruit trees. Robert was a second-generation Mexican-American in his 20s, and he also described an abundance of fruit trees that were always in Latinx neighborhoods. He said, usually you'll have an avocado tree, you'll have an orange tree, apple tree, guava tree, some type of fruit tree, maybe from wherever they're from. They usually grow here pretty well. And so when I talked to Robert, I'd already heard this thing about trees a bunch. And I was like, Robert, tell me, what's the deal with trees? And he said, well, if you're Latino and you don't have a fruit tree at your house, it's like you're not really Latino. So in many cases, nature is a place to meet God. That was a common theme in the stories, connecting through nature, with nature through love and relationality, not victimhood. So dominant understandings of environmentalism tend to think about communities of color through a focus on suffering. La Tierra environmentalism balances cases of victimhood with a focus on the positive experiences and connections that minoritized communities have with the natural world. All right, point number 2. A second aspect of La Tierra environmentalism is that it recognizes a sense of relationality with nature and sees nature as an aspect of everyday life. So in dominant notions of environmentalism, the focus is on saving an endangered planet Earth from human harm. So modern environmentalism is rooted in the stories that I talked about briefly before, connecting to the land through leisure and recreation, like camping and visiting national parks. The pristine, unpeopled landscapes that we may love to visit in wilderness areas and national parks are made possible by the forces of settler colonialism and the forced removal of indigenous people and other communities who'd been living in sustainable relationship with the land for centuries. So in dominant notions of environmentalism, nature is out there and it's separate from the experiences of daily life. But in La Tierra environmental narratives, they often center on humans' intimate relationships with the land. So the comment from before about loving the plant like a brother. So I'm going to tell you about Mariana. This is not a picture of Mariana. It's a picture I found on the internet of somebody that has chickens in her backyard. But it's kind of, you can picture Mariana because this person's story is similar. So Mariana was an educator in her early 50s who immigrated to the U.S. from Lima, Peru as a young adult. She had loved nature since her boyfriend introduced her to camping and hiking many years ago. Mariana told me she rarely went hiking or camping anymore, but she loved spending time outdoors. As she explained it, I have a nice big backyard and I like to plant seeds and grow things. And I have 5 chickens in my yard. I like to be with them and hold them and talk to them. I have a lot of birds that come into my yard because there's chicken food everywhere. Mariana said that every morning when she woke up, she looked at the tree right outside her window. I hear the birds and I just thank God for allowing me to hear this music from the birds. Then when I go outside, I try to make a very conscious effort to recognize that these things are gifts from God. So there's a common concept that people often use to explain why the environment is a religious issue. It's called stewardship. Has anybody ever heard of stewardship? Yeah. Do you want to take a venture at what it is? Fast. All right. Thanks for raising your hand anyway. I appreciate that. It's basically the idea that humans are called to care for the earth because the earth is a gift from God. And this is a very common way that particularly Christian and maybe Jewish communities will talk about caring for the earth. So this is from the website of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles on their kind of creation care page. This is an example of stewardship. God made this earth, not for its own sake, but to be a home for the human family. The good things of creation are meant to be shared, developed, and used for the good of all of his children. And if you'll note here, the earth is in a human hand, right? So it's kind of suggesting, it's conveying, right, that humans are separate from the earth. We can hold the earth in our hands instead of us being part of the earth. In my research, some Latinx Catholics offered versions of a stewardship argument when they explained why it's important to take care of the earth. But there is a second explanation that also emerged across sites, which is this. It's important to protect the environment because of the biblical mandate to love your neighbor as yourself. So that's different from stewardship explanations that put humans as separate from and above nature. This is a more relational viewpoint that sees humans and the rest of nature as part of the same reality. The love your neighbor part is Christian because it directly references the Bible, but the assumption that neighbor involves the more than human world reflects more of an indigenous relational worldview. For many of my interlocutors, the line between humans and the rest of nature was blurred. And many people talked about elements of nature as kin. And I will say that's much more, the book is organized first generation and then second generation and beyond. This is much more common. Nature as kin was much more common among first generation immigrants. But we have this quote from Roger before. God created everything. We have to love all of creation. We love a plant like a brother. Neglecting nature is like seeing a brother in the street and not helping him. Cutting trees is like scorning a brother. And then during that same focus group, another person built on that comment. He described nature as a neighbor because he said that caring for nature is a fundamental aspect of faith because everything is interconnected. To love God is to love your neighbor. Because God created everything, if we want to be loving to God, we must be concerned with all aspects of life. So by describing nature and trees as part of society, as a brother, and as a neighbor, these comments combine a Catholic commitment to the value of human life with an indigenous relational worldview that blurs distinctions between humans and the rest of the world. La Tierra environmental narratives also focus heavily on recognizing that humans depend on the land. So stories of people whose parents grew up on a farm or a ranch in Mexico, and they knew that they wouldn't have enough to eat if the rain didn't come. I had somebody tell me, for her, you get food at the grocery store, but her parents experienced, you have to have rain to get food. And that, water isn't necessarily something that can just come out of the hose. And so even though she grew up, being able to get food at the grocery store and water from the hose, her parents were always reminding her, that we depend on things and that, that it's not just a given that all of those resources are there. Furthermore, in La Tierra environmental narratives, nature is the stuff that surrounds everyday life. It's the air we breathe, the birds nesting in the trees in the front yard, the mountains outside the window in Latin America. There's lots of stories people were telling me like, oh, back home, we're surrounded by nature. There's mountains, there's trees, there's beaches. La Tierra environmentalism is about cherishing the relationships with nature in everyday life, much more than or in addition to protecting faraway landscapes from human incursion. There's a sense that nature is a place to meet God. All right. My third and actually my favorite aspect of La Tierra environmentalism is that it's transmitted primarily in the private spaces of the home, most often through the example of pious, admired women. In the book, I call this abuelita environmentalism, grandmother environmentalism, because there's lots of stories about values learned from mom or grandma. So even when people are aware of church teachings on environmental issues, they often would cite family members as the source of their environmental values. So one example of this is somebody I'm calling Esmeralda, who is a retired school teacher. And she just spent all of her time after retirement focusing on ministries in the church. Homelessness and incarceration were kind of her main issues, but she also was involved with everything. So when there was a Laudato Si ministry at her church, she joined. And that's how I met her, through her Laudato Si ministry. She told me about Laudato Si with great enthusiasm and talked about transitioning to solar energy, making small lifestyle changes at home, recycling more. But aside from answering my direct questions about Laudato Si, she talked much more about the environmental values she learned from her grandma, who was an immigrant from Chihuahua, Mexico, and her grandma had raised her. Esmeralda told me that when she was growing up in El Paso, Texas, her family was really poor and her grandma made everything from scratch. Her grandma would prepare food in the kitchen and didn't waste a thing. She made her own clothing. They would hang clothes on the line to dry. Esmeralda emphasized that her childhood included struggles, but they were really happy. She said even though they were poor, thanks to her grandma's hard labor, she said, we ate pretty good. Rice and beans, fresh tortillas, who could go wrong? So I asked Esmeralda, okay, is this related to your religion? And she said, yes, because my grandma was very, very into her Catholicism. Esmeralda learned her environmental values from her resilient, working-class grandmother, a pious Catholic who prayed all the time. Her grandma was the exemplar of Catholic piety, and since her grandma had embraced conservationist measures, Esmeralda associated those measures with her Catholic faith as well. So retaining practices like sewing her own clothing, turning off the lights, not wasting food, those were ways of connecting with her grandma's memory and embodying a strong connection with God, and just also a sense that it's the right thing to do. Another set of stories I'll tell is from two sisters named Rebecca and Elena, who are in their late 20s. I met them through a focus group. They were involved with a ministry through the Archdiocese, basically for young adult leaders throughout the LA Archdiocese. They were working on a project for Spanish-speaking young adult leaders. So Rebecca and Elena told me that taking care of the environment was an important part of the social justice tradition of the Catholic Church. And they knew a lot about global environmental issues like climate change, the Pacific garbage patch. They were familiar with environmental problems. They also were familiar with Pope Francis's teachings from Laudato Si, but they said the encyclical didn't teach us anything new because it basically just reiterated lessons that they had been learning from their mom throughout their lives. So they came from a family of 4. Their father was the sole breadwinner and he was a garbage collector. And so they told me that growing up, they were very aware of their financial precarity. One of them said, we know the value of $1. Their mom taught them how many hours their dad would work to pay for anything, right? Like, oh, you want that doll? That's 3 hours worth of work from your dad. As children, their family recycled and conserved because that they knew that the environment was in trouble. And their mom also would point out the struggles of workers, right? Like, see that guy selling oranges by the road? Look how hard he's working. He's out there in the sun. He's probably barely making anything for all of his hard work. The sisters associated these lessons with a very expansive view of environmentalism. When I asked them, is this related to your religion? They said yes. And again, they didn't cite the Bible. They didn't cite Laudato Si, although they knew that you could find these things in the Bible and Laudato Si. They talked about their mom. Elena said, being Catholic, my mom always brought me up not to be wasteful. And it was always hand in hand with church teachings, like social justice. You shouldn't be wasteful. You should take what you need, and if you can, give to others. They learned to be environmentalists through their mother's daily prayers. Before every meal, their mother would offer a lengthy prayer asking God to bless everyone who had contributed to the meal they were about to eat, such as the campesinos who had harvested their vegetables. They said prayers over Thanksgiving meals were really detailed, sometimes lasting more than 10 minutes because their mother had to bless everybody. Rebecca said, you think about everything that went into that platter of vegetables in front of you, even the truck driver. So these stories of home-based conservationist measures were widespread throughout my research and often, told through stories from mom and grandma. They're often connected to poverty, absolutely, but they're also connected to resilient, pious women, inherited traditions, respect from family and God. So in these stories, it's important to turn off the lights to save money, and because it's the right thing to do. And it's also, I'm arguing, environmentalism, right? So in conclusion, La Tierra environmentalism represents one of many overlooked theories of the environment, where living in respectful relationship with the earth is not a matter of environmentalism. Instead, it's just a routine aspect of everyday life and a matter of common sense. It might be tempting to dismiss the sustainable practices of working class immigrant communities as merely the result of limited financial means. But refusing to accept their practices as environmental denies the strength of these communities' moral frameworks and perpetuates white supremacist ideologies and our definitions of environmentalism. In the conclusion of my book, I make a few recommendations to scholars, policymakers, and environmental activists, so I'll just share a few things. For my fellow white scholars in religious studies and the environmental humanities, I argue that we need to do better by seeing and uplifting perspectives that might not look like our own. Acknowledging the legitimacy of La Tierra environmentalism requires us to recognize the limitations of our own paradigms and allow our intellectual frameworks to be challenged. Policymakers and environmental leaders can also strengthen their approach by expanding their notions of who can count as an environmental agent. So we need science, like we're in the science building, right? Yeah. This is where they're doing research on sustainable buildings, I think you said. Yeah, we need that. We need research on sustainable buildings from scientists. We need highly trained scientists who conduct research and publish peer-reviewed articles and reports. Those are very important. But we also need to learn from the wisdom of people who've been grappling with the effects of climate destruction for centuries, of environmental destruction for centuries, who are already living in ways that are sustainable and conducive to long-term human existence on Earth. Sometimes the expertise comes from computer models and peer-reviewed articles and reports, and sometimes it comes from the embodied knowledge and life experiences of people whose livelihoods depend on the land. I'm going to offer my final conclusion, actually just reading you the last two paragraphs of the book, where I talk directly to you, the students who are here. So I write, for my students at California State University, Northridge, and other emerging leaders who are bringing their communities diverse forms of knowledge and expertise to our higher education classrooms, that's you guys, I've written this book to say that we need you. Many first-generation college students draw from multiple forms of wisdom as a matter of daily life. While they've learned to navigate the secular world of the modern university, they also remain intimately tied to the resilient, land-based communities of their ancestors, who knew what it meant to rely on the earth and who cultivated relationships of gratitude, mutuality, and respect. In my own classrooms, students have told me about plant-loving tias who talk to their flowers as if they were their own children. Subsistence farming grandfathers who did not have enough to eat when the rain did not come on time. And the backbreaking labor of parents, aunts, and uncles who toiled as migrant farm workers in the fields of Central California. Over and over again, my students have written about childhood lessons where they have learned that you must take care of the earth because the earth takes care of you. I have written this book to convey that your voices, perspectives, and experiences matter. The models that global leaders have developed and the solutions they have proposed have not risen to the challenges that we face, and the situation with the climate is only getting worse. Please draw from your multiple forms of wisdom and moral frameworks that you value as you develop creative models for a better world and demand that your perspectives be heard. We cannot solve these problems without you.